It was an ordinary afternoon at a bustling McDonald's, where the familiar sounds of trays clattering, children laughing, and the sizzle of fries filled the air. Morgan Freeman, the renowned actor with his distinctive voice and calming presence, walked in wearing a simple baseball cap and sunglasses, hoping for a quiet meal away from the spotlight. He had grown accustomed to the recognition that followed him everywhere, but on this day, he just wanted to blend in and enjoy a moment of normalcy. The McDonald's was crowded with the usual mix of families, teenagers, and workers on their lunch breaks. Morgan stood in line patiently waiting his turn, his eyes scanning the menu even though he already knew exactly what he wanted. After ordering his usual, a quarter-pounder with cheese, fries, and a sweet tea, he found a quiet corner table near the back wall where he could sit with his back to most of the restaurant. As Morgan settled into his seat, he let out a quiet sigh of relief. These moments of ordinary life had become precious to him, small islands of calm in the constant sea of fame. He unwrapped his burger slowly, savoring the simple pleasure of an unhurried meal in a place where people were too busy with their own lives to bother him. Across the room, a young boy no older than 5 sat with his mother at a small table. The child's wide eyes scanned the restaurant with unusual intensity for someone so young. Though he looked like any other child with his brightly colored t-shirt and small hands clutching a toy from his Happy Meal, there was something different about him. His gaze was sharp, almost unnervingly alert, as if he were searching for something or someone. Morgan didn't notice the boy at first, focused as he was on his meal and the brief respite it offered. But as he took a sip of his sweet tea, he felt the subtle weight of someone's attention on him. Looking up, his eyes met the child's gaze from across the room. For the briefest moment, their eyes locked, and Morgan felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The boy's eyes held a wisdom far beyond his years, a deep, knowing look that seemed to penetrate right through Morgan's carefully maintained public persona. It wasn't the typical wide-eyed recognition he sometimes saw in children who recognized him from movies. This was something else entirely, something that made Morgan's hand pause halfway to his mouth, his burger momentarily forgotten. The boy's mother was occupied with her phone, scrolling through messages and occasionally taking a bite of her salad, completely unaware of the strange connection forming between her son and the famous actor sitting across the restaurant. The boy continued to stare, his expression unnervingly serious for a child so young. Morgan looked away, trying to shake off the unusual feeling. He'd encountered all sorts of fans over the years, some respectful, some overeager, some simply struck speechless in his presence. But this child's gaze felt different. It wasn't awe or excitement he saw in those young eyes. It was something like recognition, as if the boy somehow knew him beyond his public image. Taking another bite of his burger, Morgan tried to focus on his meal, on the mundane pleasure of sitting in a fast food restaurant like anyone else. But he couldn't shake the feeling of the boy's eyes on him, steady and unwavering. When he glanced up again, the child was still watching him, and now there was something else in his expression, a sense of urgency, as if he needed to tell Morgan something important. Minutes passed as Morgan continued his meal, occasionally looking up to find the boy still watching him. Then, as Morgan was finishing his fries, something changed. The boy whispered something to his mother, who absent-mindedly nodded without looking up from her phone. Then, with determination in his small face, the child slid off his chair and began walking directly toward Morgan's table. Morgan straightened slightly, unsure what to expect. Children approached him sometimes, usually urged on by parents eager for an autograph or photo, but this felt different. The mother remained oblivious, still focused on her phone, while the boy moved with purpose across the restaurant floor. "Hello. There, young man," Morgan said kindly as the boy reached his table, his deep voice gentle and welcoming despite his unease. The boy didn't smile. Instead, he looked directly into Morgan's eyes with that same unsettling intensity. Then, without preamble, he leaned in close to Morgan's ear and began to whisper. At first, Morgan's expression remained neutral, the polite interest of a celebrity accustomed to random encounters with fans. But as the boy continued whispering, Morgan's face changed. The warm smile faded. His eyebrows drew together in concern. The color began to drain from his face, leaving him ashen beneath his usual warm complexion. The boy spoke quietly, his small voice barely audible above the restaurant noise, but his words landed with the impact of thunder. He described things no child should know, specific details, names, locations, all delivered with a chilling certainty that made the hair on Morgan's arm stand on end. "They're still alive," the boy whispered finally, his voice taking on an almost pleading quality. "But not for long. The lady with the red hair and the man with the scar, they need help now." Morgan's hand trembled slightly as he placed his napkin on the table. How could this child know about the news story he'd seen just that morning? The missing couple from 2 counties over, details the police had explicitly kept from the public. The woman's distinctive red hair, the man's facial scar from military service. These weren't public knowledge. "How do you know this?" Morgan asked, his voice lower and more urgent than before. The boy just shook his head, those wise eyes suddenly filling with tears. "I see things sometimes, bad things, please help them. The house with the blue door on Maple Street, basement." Morgan's breath caught in his throat. The address hadn't been mentioned in any news report he'd seen. This wasn't possible. And yet, the certainty in the child's eyes left no room for doubt. With fingers that didn't feel quite steady, Morgan reached for his phone. The boy stepped back, watching as Morgan quickly unlocked the screen and dialed 911, his movements precise despite the shock evident on his face. "Newan, what's your emergency?" came the dispatcher's voice. Morgan took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "My name is Morgan Freeman. I'm at the McDonald's on Highway 16. I need to report information about the missing couple from Westlake County. This is going to sound strange, but I have reason to believe they're being held at a house with a blue door on Maple Street." As Morgan spoke to the dispatcher, providing details with the grave authority that had narrated so many films, the boy slowly backed away, returning to his mother, who still hadn't noticed his absence. But just before the child turned away, he met Morgan's eyes one final time, and the actor saw something there that chilled him even more deeply than the whispered words. Relief, as if a heavy burden had finally been passed to someone strong, enough to carry it. Morgan Freeman kept his voice steady as he spoke to the 911 dispatcher, maintaining his composure despite the unsettling encounter that had left his hands slightly trembling. The operator's professional tone shifted noticeably when he identified himself, skepticism giving way to attentiveness as the dispatcher recognized the distinctive voice that had narrated countless documentaries and films. "Mr. Freeman, can you explain how you came by this information?" the dispatcher asked, her voice careful and measured. Morgan glanced across the restaurant at the young boy, now quietly eating his happy meal, as if nothing unusual had happened. "That's complicated," he replied. "A child just approached me here at McDonald's and provided these details. I know it sounds implausible, but the information is too specific to ignore." The dispatcher assured him officers would be dispatched immediately, both to the McDonald's and to the address on Maple Street. Morgan thanked her and ended the call, his eyes never leaving the boy and his still distracted mother. The weight of the child's words hung heavily in the air around him, impossible to dismiss yet equally impossible to explain. Within minutes, the McDonald's parking lot filled with the flashing lights of police cruisers. 2 officers entered the restaurant first, their expressions shifting from professional neutrality to subtle surprise as they spotted Morgan Freeman waiting for them near the entrance. "Mr. Freeman, I'm Officer Daniels, this is Officer Rivera," the taller of the 2 said, extending his hand. "Dispatch informed us you have information about the Westlake missing persons case." Morgan nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, though I'm not sure you'll believe how I came by it." He gestured discreetly toward the small table where the boy and his mother sat. "That young boy approached me a few minutes ago and provided specific details about the missing couple. Details I don't believe have been released to the public." Officer Rivera's eyebrows rose slightly. "And you've never met this child before?" "Never," Morgan confirmed. "He simply walked up to my table and started whispering information, names, descriptions, and an address, a house with a blue door on Maple Street. He said they're in the basement, and they don't have much time." Officers exchanged glances, their professional skepticism evident yet tempered by the source of the information. After all, this wasn't just anyone. This was Morgan Freeman, a man known for his integrity and measured judgment. "We have officers heading to the Maple Street location now," Officer Daniels said. "But we'd like to speak with the boy and his mother, if that's all right with you." Morgan nodded, leading them toward the table. The mother finally looked up from her phone as the officers approached, her expression shifting quickly from confusion to alarm. "Ma'am, there's no cause for concern," Officer Rivera said reassuringly. "We just need to ask your son a few questions." "My name is Officer Rivera, and this is Officer Daniels." The woman glanced between the officers, Morgan Freeman and her son, bewilderment clear on her face. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, this is my son, Lucas. Has something happened?" Before the officers could respond, Lucas looked up at them with those unnervingly knowing eyes. "You're going to find them at the house with the blue door," he said simply. "The bad man isn't there right now, but he comes back at night." Sarah's face paled. "Lucas, what are you talking about?" She turned to the officers. "I'm sorry, he has a very active imagination." Officer Daniels crouched down to Lucas's level. "Hey there, Lucas. Can you tell me how you know about the people at the house with the blue door?" Lucas shrugged, a gesture that seemed too old for his small shoulders. "I just know sometimes. I see things in my head." He picked up a French fry, examining it with sudden childlike interest that contrasted sharply with his previous intensity. The officers continued questioning him gently, while Morgan stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold. Lucas answered with that same disconcerting mixture of childlike simplicity and impossible knowledge, describing the red-haired woman's necklace with a small butterfly pendant, mentioning the man's military tattoo that hadn't been in any public reports. Sarah Mitchell's confusion gradually transformed into a different kind of concern. "Lucas has always been different," she admitted quietly to Morgan while the officers spoke with her son. "He knows things sometimes, things he shouldn't possibly know. Our pediatrician says some children are just more perceptive, but this—" She shook her head, watching her son with worried eyes. Officer Rivera's radio crackled to life. She stepped away to answer it, her expression growing more serious as she listened to the transmission. When she returned, her skepticism had vanished entirely. "We've got officers at the Maple Street location," she said in a low voice to her partner. "There's a house with a blue door at number 1421. They're requesting backup and a warrant immediately. They've observed signs of forced entry in the back and what appears to be blood on a window." Officer Daniels nodded sharply. "Mr. Freeman," he said, turning to Morgan, "we need to take this seriously. I'd like to get a formal statement from you about your interaction with Lucas." Morgan agreed readily, his deep voice carrying a gravity that matched the situation. "Of course, whatever you need." As Officer Rivera stepped away to coordinate with dispatch, Morgan found himself drawn back to Lucas. The boy was now coloring on his placemat with crayons provided by his mother, his small hand moving with the carefree motions of any child his age. It was almost impossible to reconcile this ordinary scene with the chilling knowledge the boy had demonstrated moments before. "I'd like to stay involved, if I may," Morgan said to Officer Daniels. "I feel somewhat responsible, being the one he chose to approach." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We'll need to take your statement at the station. You're welcome to follow us there." As they prepared to leave, Lucas looked up from his coloring. His eyes met Morgan's across the restaurant, and the actor felt that same inexplicable connection that had unsettled him earlier. "They're scared," Lucas said simply, "but they're still hoping someone will find them." Sarah gathered her son's things, apologizing again to the officers. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Neither did Morgan, but as he followed the officers out to the parking lot, he couldn't shake the absolute certainty that had been in Lucas's voice. The boy knew something impossible, yet undeniably real, and somehow Morgan had become entangled in whatever strange perception allowed a 5-year-old child to see what others couldn't. As he slid behind the wheel of his car to follow the police cruiser to the station, Morgan glanced back at the McDonald's. Through the window, he could see Lucas looking out at him. those old eyes in a young face watching as Morgan prepared to follow the thread of the boy's mysterious knowledge to whatever unsettling truth lay at its end. Morgan Freeman followed the police cruiser through the quiet streets of the small Georgia town, his hands steady on the steering wheel, despite the turmoil of thoughts racing through his mind. The encounter with Lucas, the boy with old eyes and impossible knowledge, had shaken him more than he cared to admit. After providing his statement at the police station, he had been surprised when Detective Harlow, the lead investigator on the Westlake missing persons case, allowed him to follow along at a distance as they investigated the house on Maple Street. "Normally we wouldn't allow this," Detective Harlow had explained, her sharp eyes studying Morgan's face, "but considering the unusual circumstances and your involvement in bringing this information forward, you can observe from a safe distance." Now, Morgan pulled his car to a stop half a block away from 1421 Maple Street, a modest two-story house with peeling paint and an unmistakable blue door. Police cruisers lined the street, their lights casting red and blue shadows that danced across the neighboring homes. Officers moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter around the property, while plainclothes detectives conferred near the front walkway. Morgan rolled down his window slightly, the evening air carrying the murmured conversations of officers and the static bursts of police radios. He watched as Detective Harlow approached the house, accompanied by two uniformed officers. From his vantage point, he could see the determination in her stride as she climbed the worn front steps. The wait felt interminable. Morgan found himself thinking of Lucas and his mother, now waiting at the police station. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "They're still alive, but not for long. But not for—" The certainty in those young eyes had been impossible to dismiss, even for a man who had seen as much of the world as Morgan had. After what seemed like an eternity, but was likely only 15 minutes, Morgan noticed a shift in the energy around the house. Officers who had been maintaining positions around the perimeter suddenly tensed, hands moving to their weapons. Detective Harlow emerged from the front door, her face grim as she spoke rapidly into her radio. Moments later, paramedics who had been standing by rushed toward the house, equipment in hand. Morgan's breath caught in his throat. The boy had been right. His phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed the police station's number. "Mr. Freeman," came Detective Harlow's voice, tight with controlled emotion. "We've found them, both of them. They're alive, but in bad condition. The medics are working on them now." Morgan closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him. "Thank God," he said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "The thing is," Detective Harlow continued, hesitation evident in her tone, "the details the boy gave you, they're all correct, down to the butterfly necklace and the military tattoo. There's no way he could have known these things." She paused. "We're going to need to speak with him again. And with you." "Of course," Morgan replied. "Whatever you need." As he ended the call, Morgan watched the flurry of activity at the house intensify. The front door opened again, and he saw paramedics carefully maneuvering a stretcher through the doorway. Even from his distance, he could make out the flash of red hair belonging to the woman strapped to the gurney, an oxygen mask covering her face. Minutes later, a second stretcher emerged, bearing a man whose arm hung limply at his side, revealing the edge of a tattoo that Lucas had described with such precision. Two ambulances pulled up and the victims were quickly loaded inside. As the vehicles pulled away, sirens wailing, Morgan noticed Detective Harlow walking toward his car. "They've been held for nearly a week," she said, as she approached, her face showing the strain of what she'd witnessed inside. "Dehydrated, malnourished, and the man has several broken ribs, but they'll survive thanks to that boy's whatever it was." "Have you found their captor?" Morgan asked, the gravity of his famous voice matching the seriousness of the situation. Detective Harlow shook her head. "Not yet, but we've got officers positioned nearby. If he returns, we'll be waiting." She hesitated, then added, "We found something else you should know about, evidence suggesting this isn't his first time doing this. There are trophies from other victims." Morgan's expression darkened. "Lucas mentioned the bad man, said he comes back at night." That's what the victims told us too, Harlow confirmed. He leaves during the day for work, returns in the evening. We're setting up surveillance now. Morgan glanced at his watch. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. I should get back to the station, he said. I want to check on Lucas and his mother. Detective Harlow nodded. I'll meet you there shortly. We're going to need all the information we can get if we're going to catch this guy before he realizes his victims have been found. As Morgan drove back toward the police station, his mind was filled with questions. How could a 5-year-old boy possibly know such specific details about a crime? What was the source of the knowledge in those unsettlingly wise eyes? And why? Had Lucas chosen him, of all people, to approach with this information? The police station was quieter than when he'd left, the evening shift settling in for the night. Morgan was directed to a small conference room where Sarah Mitchell sat beside her son, who was coloring intently on a piece of paper provided by one of the officers. When Morgan entered, Lucas looked up immediately, those knowing eyes finding his. You found them, the boy said. It wasn't a question. Morgan nodded, taking a seat across from them. Yes, we did. They're hurt, but the doctors are going to help them. Sarah looked between her son and the famous actor, bewilderment still evident on her tired face. I don't understand how this is happening, she admitted quietly. Lucas has known things before, small things, but nothing like this. Lucas continued coloring, apparently untroubled by the extraordinary situation he had set in motion. His small hand moved the crayon in careful strokes across the paper. Has he ever done anything like this before? Morgan asked gently. Sarah shook her head. He's always been intuitive. He knows when I'm sad, even when I'm hiding it. Once he insisted we take a different route home, and later we found out there had been a terrible accident on our usual road. She looked at her son with a mixture of wonder and fear. But this, knowing about kidnapped people, specific details about them, no, never anything like this. Lucas looked up from his drawing. The bad man has done it before, he said matter-of-factly. And he'll do it again if you don't stop him. Morgan and Sarah fell silent, the child's words hanging heavy in the room. Outside, the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky as night descended on the small town. And somewhere in that darkness, a man was returning to a house with a blue door, unaware that his secrets had been revealed by a child who somehow saw what others couldn't. The police station hummed with activity as night fell. What had begun as a strange tip from a child had transformed into a major operation, with officers and detectives moving with renewed purpose. The rescue of the Westlake couple had validated Lucas's inexplicable knowledge, turning skepticism into an urgent pursuit of the perpetrator who remained at large. Morgan Freeman sat quietly in the corner of the conference room, watching as detective. Harlow gently questioned Lucas. The boy seemed remarkably at ease despite the circumstances, answering questions with the same unsettling mixture of childlike simplicity and impossible insight that had first caught Morgan's attention in the McDonalds. Lucas, Detective Harlow said, her voice kind but professional, can you tell me more about the bad man? Did you see what he looks like? Lucas paused in his coloring, considering the question with a seriousness that seemed out of place on his young face. He looks normal, he said finally. That's why no one notices. Brown hair. He wears glasses sometimes, but not always. There's a scar on his hand that looks like a star. Sarah Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes never leaving her son. Lucas, honey, how do you know these things? The question had been asked repeatedly, but the answer remained elusive. The boy shrugged. I just see them, in my head, like watching TV, but inside. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. An officer entered and whispered something to Detective Harlow, whose expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She nodded and turned back to the group. The victims are stable, she informed them. They've been able to provide some information. The man's name is Carroll Mercer, a local with no prior record. He works at the hardware store on Main Street and, according to our victims, returns home around 8:30 each evening. Morgan glanced at his watch. It was nearly 8:01 p.m. We have officers in position at the house, Detective Harlow continued, but I have some concerns. She hesitated, glancing at Lucas before addressing Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, your son's description of the suspect matches what our victims have told us. Every detail, the glasses, the scar on his hand, it's all consistent. I need to ask, has Lucas ever met this man? Could he have seen him somewhere before? Sarah shook her head firmly. We've only lived in town for 2 months. Lucas doesn't go to the hardware store. We haven't had any repairs done. I don't see how he could possibly know this person. Morgan watched Lucas, who had returned to his drawing with the focused concentration of a child. But the picture-taking, shape beneath his crayons, was disturbing. A dark outline of a house, with what appeared to be a small window below ground level where a face peered out. "Lucas," Morgan said quietly, his deep voice drawing the boy's attention. "Is that the house with the blue door?" Lucas nodded. "This is the window in the basement. You can't see it from outside because of the bushes, but they could see out a little bit." Detective Harlow leaned forward. "Lucas, are there other places? Other people this man has hurt?" The boy's crayon stilled on the paper. He looked up, his eyes meeting Harlow's with that unnerving directness. "Yes. There was a place before, with a red roof, and there will be another place after. He's already getting it ready." The room fell silent. Morgan exchanged glances with Detective Harlow, whose professional composure couldn't entirely mask her discomfort at the child's words. "Getting it ready?" she prompted gently. "What do you mean, Lucas?" "Another house, far away from people. He goes there sometimes with tools and food. No one lives there, but he's fixing it for someone." Sarah's hand went to her mouth, her face pale with shock. "How could he possibly know this?" she whispered. Before anyone could answer, the door opened. Again. This time the police chief entered, his expression grave. "Detective Harlow, a word," he requested, gesturing toward the hallway. When she returned moments later, her face was set with new determination. "We've got a situation," she announced. "Officers at the Blue House report that Mercer pulled up, spotted the unmarked cars, and fled the scene. He's currently being pursued, heading west on County Road 16. Morgan straightened. "Toward the highway?" "Yes," Harlow confirmed. "And if he reaches it, he could be halfway to the next state before we can set up proper roadblocks." Lucas put down his crayon and looked up. "He won't go to the highway," he said with quiet certainty. "He'll go to the other house, the one he's getting ready." Detective Harlow stared at the boy for a long moment before making a decision. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to ask something unusual. Would you and Lucas be willing to accompany officers in a helicopter search? If Lucas can recognize this other property—" Sarah looked terrified at the prospect. "A helicopter? I don't know if that's appropriate for a 5-year-old. He's already been through so much today," Morgan intervened, his calm voice a counterpoint to the room's tension. "I understand your concerns, Sarah, but if there's even a chance Lucas could help locate this man before he hurts someone else—" "I want to help," Lucas said simply, looking at his mother with pleading eyes. "I can find the other house." Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but I'm staying with him the entire time." Within 20 minutes, they were boarding a police helicopter at a small airfield on the edge of town. Morgan had been invited to join them at Detective Harlow's insistence. "You seem to have a rapport with the boy," she had explained, "and frankly, I could use another adult perspective on whatever this is." As the helicopter lifted into the night sky, Morgan watched Lucas press his face against the window, his expression one of wonder rather than fear. The lights of the small town spread out below them, a constellation of human life against the darkness. "We've got reports that the suspect's vehicle was last seen heading northwest toward the county line," the pilot informed them over the intercom. "We'll start our search pattern there." Lucas shook his head. "Not that way," he said, pointing toward the west. "That way, where the big trees are." Detective Harlow conferred briefly with the pilot, who adjusted their course accordingly. As they flew over increasingly rural landscape, Lucas remained focused on the terrain below, his young eyes somehow penetrating the darkness with unnatural clarity. "There!" he suddenly exclaimed, pointing downward with absolute certainty. "That's it! The house he's fixing." Below them, barely visible among the trees, was the outline of what appeared to be a small cabin. No lights were visible, but as the helicopter circled lower, the beam of a flashlight could be seen moving inside. Detective Harlow immediately radioed the ground units, redirecting them to the new location. As they continued to circle, Morgan noticed something that sent a chill through him. A vehicle partially hidden under camouflage netting beside the cabin, matching the description of Mercer's car. "He's there," Lucas said quietly, his small hand finding Morgan's larger one. "And he's scared now. Scared people do bad things." Morgan Freeman looked into the boy's eyes and saw knowledge there that no child should possess, a window into darkness, that somehow this 5-year-old had been cursed or blessed to perceive. Whatever mysterious gift allowed Lucas to know these things, Morgan couldn't help but wonder about the price the boy might eventually pay for seeing too deeply into the shadows where others feared to look. The helicopter hovered at a safe distance, its searchlight now trained on the isolated cabin. Through the window, Morgan could see Lucas's face, illuminated in the harsh light reflected from below. The boy's expression remained eerily calm, a stark contrast to his mother's obvious distress, and Detective Harlow's focused intensity. "Ground units ETA 3 minutes, the pilot announced over the intercom. "They're requesting we maintain visual but increase our distance to avoid spooking the suspect." Detective Harlow nodded, then turned to Morgan and the Mitchells. "We'll need to pull back soon. The tactical team will handle the approach." As the helicopter began to gain altitude, Lucas suddenly pressed his small hands against the window. "He knows," the boy said, his voice carrying a certainty that made everyone fall silent. "He knows you found him." Below them, a figure emerged from the cabin, moving quickly toward the concealed vehicle. The helicopter's searchlight swung to follow him, illuminating a man in his mid-30s with brown hair and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "That's him," Lucas whispered. "The bad man." Detective Harlow immediately grabbed the radio. "Suspect is on the move. He's heading for his vehicle." The man below froze in the spotlight's glare, shielding his eyes as he looked up at the helicopter. Even from their height, Morgan could see the moment the man made his decision. Instead of continuing to his car, he spun around and sprinted back toward the cabin. "He has a gun," Lucas said quietly. "In his jacket." Sarah gasped, pulling her son closer to her side, while Detective Harlow relayed the information to the approaching units. The tension in the helicopter was palpable as they watched the man disappear back into the cabin. "Fall back to safe distance," Detective Harlow ordered the pilot. "Ground units will handle it from here." As the helicopter retreated to a higher altitude, they could see police vehicles arriving, their lights flashing through the trees as they surrounded the property. Officers in tactical gear deployed around the perimeter of the cabin, moving with practiced precision. "I cannot believe we are in this situation," Sarah murmured, her arm protectively around Lucas. "My son should be home in bed, not watching a police standoff." Morgan understood her distress, but his eyes remained on Lucas, who watched the scene below with the focused attention of someone much older. There was no fear in the boy's expression, only a strange, sad knowing. "He's not going to give up," Lucas said suddenly. "He'd rather die than go to jail." Morgan exchanged glances with Detective Harlow, whose face had hardened at the boy's words. Before she could respond, the radio crackled to life. "Suspect is barricaded inside. Negotiator is attempting contact," came the terse update. For several tense minutes, they watched from above as officers maintained their positions around the cabin. The tactical team had established a perimeter, and a negotiator was attempting to establish communication with Mercer. "He's not answering," Lucas said, just as the radio confirmed the same information. Detective Harlow studied the boy with a mixture of wonder and professional concern. "Lucas," she said carefully, "can you see what he's doing inside?" Sarah started to object, but Lucas was already nodding. "He's moving things in front of the door and he keeps looking out the windows." The boy paused, his forehead creasing slightly. "He's trying to find a way out." As if confirming his words, a small figure suddenly bolted from the rear of the cabin, sprinting toward the dense woods beyond. The helicopter's searchlight swung to track him, illuminating Mercer as he ran with desperate speed. "Suspect fleeing eastbound into the forest," Detective Harlow called into the radio. "All units converge." Morgan watched as officers pursued Mercer into the trees, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. The helicopter repositioned to maintain visual contact, hovering lower as the chase continued beneath the forest canopy. For several heart-pounding minutes, they could only catch glimpses of the pursuit through breaks in the trees. Then suddenly a clearing appeared, and they saw Mercer stumble into the open space, officers close behind him. "He's going to turn around," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. Morgan felt a chill at the boy's words, especially when, moments later, Mercer spun to face his pursuers. Even from the helicopter, they could see the glint of metal in his hand. "Gun!" an officer shouted, the cry audible even through the helicopter's noise. What followed seemed to unfold in slow motion. Officers took cover, weapons drawn. Mercer stood in the clearing, gun raised, his posture that of a man who had decided his fate. The helicopter's spotlight illuminated the standoff with merciless clarity. "Put down your weapon," the command echoed, through bullhorns from multiple directions. "You're surrounded. There's nowhere to go." Morgan felt Lucas's small hand slip into his. When he looked down, the boy's eyes were filled with a sadness that seemed ancient in his young face. "And he's thinking about all the people he hurt," Lucas whispered. "He's seeing their faces." Morgan had no response to that chilling insight. Below them, the standoff continued, Mercer's gun still raised as officers maintained their positions. "He won't surrender," Lucas said with quiet certainty. Detective Harlow had heard him. "Lucas, if you know what he's going to do, please tell us." The boy looked at the detective, then back down at the scene below. "He wants them to shoot him. He's going to—" Before Lucas could finish, Mercer made a sudden movement. The sound of gunfire reached them even through the helicopter's noise. A brief, terrible exchange that ended with Mercer crumpling to the ground. Sarah pulled Lucas against her, trying to shield him from the sight, but the boy remained calm, as if he had expected exactly this outcome. Morgan felt a deep unease at the child's composure in the face of such violence. "Is he—" Sarah couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," Detective Harlow confirmed as reports came through the radio. "Hit in the shoulder and leg. They're securing him now." Morgan watched as paramedics rushed to the clearing, working on the fallen suspect before loading him onto a stretcher. The nightmare that had begun with a whispered warning in McDonald's was ending with flashing lights in a forest clearing. "It's not over," Lucas said, his voice so soft that only Morgan heard him. "There are others." Morgan looked down at the boy, a question forming on his lips, but Lucas had turned away, suddenly every inch the tired 5-year-old he should have been all along. The strange knowing had retreated from his eyes, leaving behind only a child, who had seen far too much for his tender years. As the helicopter turned back toward town, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that while one chapter of this strange story had closed, Lucas's words suggested something far more troubling, that the darkest pages might still lie ahead, waiting to be revealed by a child who somehow saw beyond the veil that separated ordinary perception from the shadows where evil dwelled. Dawn broke over the small Georgia town, pale light filtering through the blinds of the hospital waiting room where Morgan Freeman had spent most of the night. After Mercer's capture, the investigation had moved swiftly, with search teams combing through both properties for evidence. Morgan had remained with Lucas and Sarah at the hospital, where Mercer had been brought for treatment before being transferred to the secure ward. Detective Harlow approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Morgan, who accepted it with a grateful nod. "How is he?" Morgan asked, his deep voice low to avoid disturbing Sarah, who had finally fallen asleep on a nearby couch. "Stable, refusing to talk." Detective Harlow took a seat beside him. "But the evidence is doing plenty of talking for him. We found items belonging to 3 other missing persons at the cabin, photos, personal effects." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "Trophies." Morgan's face remained composed, but his eyes reflected the gravity of her words. So Lucas was right. There were others. "Yes." Harlow glanced toward the small room where a child psychologist was gently speaking with Lucas. "The question is, how did he know? How could a 5-year-old possibly have this information?" They sat in silence for a moment, both watching through the glass as Lucas colored quietly, responding to the psychologist's questions with occasional nods or shakes of his head. "I've been a detective for 15 years, Harlow finally said. "I've seen some unexplainable things, but this—" She shook her head. "This is beyond anything in my experience." Morgan set his coffee down untouched. "When I was a child," he began, his resonant voice taking on a reflective quality, "my grandmother used to talk about people with the sight. She said some folks were born with a window in their minds that let them see things others couldn't." He paused. "I always thought they were just stories." The door to the small room opened, and the psychologist emerged, her expression thoughtful as she approached them. "How is he?" Detective Harlow asked. "Remarkably calm, considering the circumstances," the psychologist replied. "He's displaying none of the typical signs of trauma or stress one would expect." She hesitated. "He's asking to speak with Mr. Freeman." "Alone?" Morgan raised his eyebrows but nodded. "Of course." As he entered the room, Lucas looked up from his drawing, those unsettlingly wise eyes finding Morgan's immediately. The boy pushed a piece of paper across the table, a drawing of what appeared to be a map, with an X marked in the corner of a wooded area. "There's one more," Lucas said without preamble. "The lady with the yellow shoes. He put her there, but she's still alive." Morgan took a seat across from Lucas, studying the crude map. "How do you know these things, Lucas?" he asked gently. The boy was quiet for a moment, his small fingers tracing patterns on the table. "I've always known things," he finally said. "Mom says I'm special, but sometimes it scares her." He looked up at Morgan, a surprisingly adult understanding in his expression. "It scares you too?" Morgan considered denying it, then decided on honesty. "Yes, it does, not because of you, but because I don't understand it." Lucas nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Sometimes I see things in my dreams. Sometimes they just pop into my head, like someone's whispering to me." He picked up a crayon and added a small detail to his map. "The bad man, he thinks about the things he did all the time. His thoughts are really loud." "His thoughts?" Morgan echoed, trying to understand. "When I saw him in my head, I could hear what he was thinking." Lucas's voice remained matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. "He thinks about them a lot, where he put them, what he did to them." Morgan felt a chill run through him. What the boy was describing sounded impossibly like. "You read his mind," Morgan said quietly. Lucas shrugged. "I guess. I don't know how. It works. It just happens sometimes with some people." He pushed the map closer to Morgan. "But the lady with the yellow shoes doesn't have much time left. She needs help now." Morgan took the drawing, studying it more carefully. "Does Detective Harlow know about this?" "I tried to tell her, but she was busy talking to the doctors." Lucas's expression grew more urgent. "You have to make them listen. The lady is cold and scared." Morgan nodded, getting to his feet with the drawing in hand. "I'll make sure they listen." When he emerged from the room, Morgan found Detective Harlow speaking with another officer. He approached them directly, holding out Lucas's drawing. "Lucas says there's another victim," he said without preamble. "A woman, still alive somewhere, in these woods." He pointed to the X on the crude map. "He says we need to find her quickly." Detective Harlow took the map, her professional skepticism now tempered by the knowledge of Lucas's previous accuracy. "Did he say anything else?" "Yellow shoes," Morgan replied, "and that she doesn't have much time." Harlow's expression changed. "Yellow shoes?" She turned to the officer beside her. "We just got a missing persons report this morning. A jogger, last seen 3 days ago. Her husband specifically mentioned her bright yellow running shoes." Within 30 minutes, search teams were being assembled. Morgan insisted on accompanying them, feeling a responsibility to see this through. Sarah had awakened and, after checking on Lucas, joined Morgan in Detective Harlow's vehicle as they drove toward the search area. "He's always known things," Sarah said quietly as they traveled the winding rural roads. "Even as a baby, he seemed to understand things he shouldn't. He'd cry right before the phone rang with bad news. He knew when his grandfather died before anyone told us." She looked out the window at the passing landscape. "The doctors call it heightened intuition or emotional sensitivity, but it's more than that." She turned to Morgan. "Isn't it?" Morgan nodded slowly. "I believe it is." "Why did he choose you?" Sarah asked. "At McDonald's, why tell you about the kidnapped couple?" Morgan had been pondering the same question. I don't know. Perhaps because people listen to me, because of who I am. Detective Harlow, who had been listening silently, spoke up. Or perhaps because he sensed you would believe him. They arrived at the edge of a densely wooded area that matched Lucas's drawing. Search teams with dogs were already spreading out, moving methodically through the trees. Morgan stood with Sarah and Detective Harlow at the command post, watching. As the teams disappeared into the forest, barely 20 minutes later, a call came through on the radio. We've got something, Sector 4 near the old creek bed. What followed was a flurry of activity, paramedics rushing into the woods, officers securing a perimeter, and then, emerging from the trees on a stretcher, a woman, alive, though barely so, her feet still clad in mud-covered but distinctly yellow running shoes. As the ambulance sped away, its sirens wailing, Morgan looked at Sarah, whose face reflected the same mixture of awe and unease that he felt. How does he live with this? Morgan asked quietly. Seeing such things, knowing such darkness? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. He just does because he has to. She looked toward the road that would take them back to her extraordinary son. The question is, what happens now? Now that others know what he can do? It was a question Morgan had been asking himself since the moment a small boy had approached his table in McDonald's and changed everything with a whispered warning. A question for which he had no answer, as the full implications of Lucas's gift, or curse, began to unfold before them. The hospital corridor buzzed with hushed conversations as medical staff moved efficiently between rooms. The rescue of the jogger Jennifer Billings had made national news overnight. Morgan Freeman stood near the window of the waiting area, watching as reporters gathered outside the hospital entrance, their satellite vans forming a small village in the parking lot. They're calling it a miracle, Detective Harlow said, joining him at the window. Finding her alive after 3 days. Morgan nodded silently, his thoughts on the small boy who had made this miracle possible. Lucas and Sarah had been moved to a private room in a secure section of the hospital, away from the growing media attention. The official story, that anonymous tips had led to the victim's rescue, was holding for now, but Morgan wondered how long that would last. How is Miss Billings? He asked. Dehydrated, hypothermic, and traumatized, but she'll recover, Harlow replied. She's already given us a statement confirming it was Mercer who abducted her. She hesitated. She also mentioned something unusual. She said that while she was trapped, she kept having dreams of a little boy telling her help was coming, that she just needed to hold on. Morgan felt a chill despite the hospital's warmth. Lucas. That's what I thought too, Harlow admitted. But how is that even possible? It's one thing to somehow know information about crimes, but to actually communicate with victims. Before Morgan could respond, a nurse approached them. Mr. Freeman, the boy is asking for you. Morgan found Lucas sitting cross-legged on the hospital bed, a half-eaten sandwich on the tray beside him. Sarah dozed in a chair nearby, exhaustion having finally claimed her. The boy looked up as Morgan entered, those unnervingly perceptive eyes brightening. You found her, Lucas said. It wasn't a question, Morgan nodded, taking a seat beside the bed. Yes, we did, thanks to you. Lucas nodded, as if this were nothing extraordinary. She was really scared, but I told her you were coming. He picked up a crayon and began drawing on a sheet of paper. There are more people who need help. Morgan felt a weight settle in his chest. More victims of Mercer? No. Lucas shook his head. Different bad people. They're everywhere, and the people they hurt are calling out. His hand moved across the paper, sketching what appeared to be buildings. I usually can't help them, but now I can tell you, and you can help them. The implication of the child's words struck Morgan with full force. Lucas wasn't describing a one-time event. This was his ongoing reality. A 5-year-old somehow tuned into the frequency of human suffering, hearing the silent screams of victims that no one else could hear. Lucas, Morgan said gently, this is a heavy burden for someone so young. The boy continued drawing. I know. Mom says the same thing. But if I know and don't tell anyone, then it's my fault if bad things happen. Morgan's heart ached at the responsibility the child had placed on his own small shoulders. "It wouldn't be your fault, Lucas. None of this is your responsibility." Lucas looked up, his expression suddenly much older than his years. "But I can help, like with the lady with yellow shoes. If I didn't tell you, she would have died." Before Morgan could respond, Lucas pushed his drawing forward. It showed a row of buildings, with one circled multiple times. "There are people in there," he said, his voice taking on a strange urgency. "Lots of people. They're locked in and they can't get out." Morgan studied the drawing. "What is this place, Lucas?" "I don't know what it's called, but it's big and old. There are bars on the windows." He pointed to a detail in his drawing. "And there's a sign with a bird on it." Morgan took the drawing to Detective Harlow, who was speaking with the hospital's security chief about managing the media presence. Her expression grew serious as she examined Lucas's artwork. "This looks like the old Phoenix textile factory out by the county line," she said, pointing to the bird symbol Lucas had drawn. "It's been abandoned for years. There have been complaints about squatters, but—" She frowned. "What exactly did he say about it?" "That there are people locked inside who can't get out," Morgan replied. Within an hour, a tactical team had been assembled. Morgan insisted on accompanying them despite Harlow's objections. "This isn't a movie set, Mr. Freeman," she argued. "If Lucas is right, this could be a dangerous situation." "I understand," Morgan replied, his deep voice carrying the weight of his conviction. "But I need to see this through. Lucas trusted me with this information. I owe it to him to make sure it's handled properly." Reluctantly, Harlow agreed, on the condition that Morgan remain with the command unit at a safe distance. As their convoy approached the abandoned factory, Morgan was struck by how closely it resembled Lucas's drawing, right down to the faded Phoenix logo above the main entrance. The tactical team moved in silently, securing the perimeter before approaching the main building. Morgan watched from the command vehicle, tension building as the officers disappeared inside. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited for news. Finally, the radio crackled to life. "Command, this is Alpha Team. You're not going to believe this. We've got at least 20 people in here. Looks like some kind of human trafficking operation. We need medical and additional transport, ASAP." A chill ran down Morgan's spine as he heard the confirmation of Lucas's vision. Beside him, Detective Harlow was already coordinating the response, calling in ambulances and additional officers. The scale of what they had discovered was only beginning to become clear. As victims began to emerge from the building, young men and women, some barely out of their teens, many appearing malnourished and disoriented, Morgan thought of the small boy who had somehow known they were there, who had heard their silent pleas for help across whatever inexplicable connection allowed him to perceive such things. One young woman caught Morgan's eye as she was guided toward an ambulance. She walked with halting steps, her eyes wide and fearful as she took in the chaotic scene of flashing lights and uniformed officers. But what struck Morgan most was her expression, not just fear or relief, but recognition. "You came," she said. As she passed him, her voice accented and barely above a whisper. "The boy said you would come." Morgan felt his breath catch. "What boy?" "In my dreams," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "A small boy with kind eyes. He said to stay strong, so that Morgan Freeman would find us." She looked at him with wonder. "He showed me your face." As the young woman was led away, Morgan stood motionless, trying to process what he'd just heard. It was one thing for Lucas to know about victims, to perceive their locations or their suffering, but to actually appear in their dreams, to communicate with them, to give them hope. "Mr. Freeman," Detective Harlow called, breaking his reverie. "We need to get back to the hospital. One of the victims mentioned handlers returning tonight. We need to set up surveillance and prepare for more arrests." Morgan nodded, his mind still reeling from the implications of what he'd learned. As they drove back toward the hospital, he thought about Lucas, a 5-year-old boy with a gift that defied explanation, a child somehow able to reach across the barriers of space and consciousness to connect with those in desperate need. And he wondered, with equal parts wonder and concern, what such a gift might mean for Lucas's future. and for those whose lives he might yet touch with his extraordinary perception. The story broke like a tidal wave across national news networks by the following morning. Breaking: Morgan Freeman instrumental in human trafficking bust blazed across television screens nationwide. What had begun as a local investigation had exploded into a major news event, accelerated by the involvement of one of America's most recognizable actors. We have unconfirmed reports that Morgan Freeman personally provided information leading to the discovery of over 20 victims of human trafficking, announced a CNN reporter standing outside the hospital. Sources suggest this may be connected to the earlier rescue of kidnapping victims in the same county. Morgan watched the coverage from Lucas's hospital room, his expression grave. Sarah sat beside her son's bed, her face pale with worry, as she flipped between channels, each one featuring some version of the same story. "They don't know about Lucas yet," Detective Harlow said, entering the room and closing the door firmly behind her. "But it's only a matter of time. Someone always talks." "What happens when they find out?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "My son is 5 years old. He can't be exposed to this kind of attention." Morgan nodded in agreement. "She's right. We need to protect him." "I'm working on it," Harlow assured them. "We've arranged for a police escort to take you to a safe location once Lucas is cleared to leave the hospital. In the meantime, this floor is secured. No press allowed." As if on cue, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Morgan could hear raised voices and the unmistakable sound of camera shutters clicking rapidly. "Mr. Freeman, can you comment on your involvement in the rescue?" someone called out. Harlow muttered under her breath and stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind her. Through the window, Morgan could see her confronting a reporter who had somehow made it past security, a uniformed officer already escorting the intruder toward the elevator. "It's starting," Morgan said quietly. "And it will only get worse." Sarah looked at her son, who was drawing peacefully, seemingly unbothered by the chaos beginning to swirl around him. "I never wanted this for him," she whispered. "His ability. It's been hard enough helping him navigate normal childhood. How do I protect him from this?" Morgan had no easy answer. His own fame had taught him the relentless nature of media attention, how it could distort reality, invade privacy, and transform ordinary lives into public spectacles. The thought of Lucas being subjected to that scrutiny was deeply troubling. "They'll want to know how we found those people," Morgan said, gesturing toward the muted television where footage showed victims being led from the abandoned factory. "And eventually they'll learn about Lucas." "I won't let them exploit him," Sarah said with sudden fierceness. "He's not some sideshow attraction." Lucas looked up from his drawing. "It's okay, Mom," he said with that disconcerting adult calm. "Mr. Freeman will help us." Morgan felt the weight of the boy's trust settle on his shoulders. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from his longtime manager. "What's going on? Every network is calling. Need to talk ASAP." The next 48 hours unfolded in a blur of activity. The human trafficking ring had expanded beyond the abandoned factory, with 8 arrests made and investigations spreading to 3 neighboring states. The Westlake kidnapping victims had been released from the hospital and were reuniting with their families. Jennifer Billings, the jogger with the yellow shoes, had given a tearful interview thanking the anonymous tipster who had saved her life. Through it all, Morgan worked with Detective Harlow to keep Lucas and Sarah shielded from the growing media frenzy. He had issued a brief statement acknowledging his presence during the investigations, but declining further comment out of respect for the ongoing case. But as Harlow had predicted, someone talked. 3 days after the factory raid, a local officer leaked information to a reporter about the psychic kid who had provided the crucial tips. By that evening, speculation was running rampant across social media and news outlets. Sources claim a child with apparent psychic abilities may have been the key to recent rescues, announced one reporter. Questions are being raised about Morgan Freeman's connection to this extraordinary situation. Sarah watched the reports in growing horror from the safe house where they had been relocated. "They're going to find us," she said, pulling Lucas closer to her side. "They'll never leave him alone now." Morgan, who had joined them at the secure location, shared her concern. His own experience with media attention had taught him its destructive potential, but he also recognized an opportunity amid the danger. "We can't stop them from reporting the story," he said, his deep voice steady and reassuring. "But we can control the narrative." He made several calls, consulting with publicists, lawyers, and trusted colleagues. By the next morning, he had developed a strategy. "I'd like to make one statement," he told Sarah, "a single, carefully worded message that acknowledges Lucas's contribution without revealing details about his abilities. After that, no interviews, no follow-ups, nothing." "And you think that will satisfy them?" Sarah asked skeptically. "No," Morgan admitted, "but it will give them something, while making it clear that Lucas's privacy is non-negotiable." With Sarah's reluctant approval, Morgan arranged for a brief press conference outside the county courthouse. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, he stepped up to the microphones, his dignified presence immediately commanding attention. "Over the past week, our community has witnessed the rescue of several people in desperate circumstances," he began, his iconic voice carrying across the crowd. "I was fortunate enough to play a small role in these events, for which I am grateful. But the true hero of this story is a young boy who, through extraordinary intuition and courage, brought critical information to light." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "This child deserves our protection and our respect. He is not a curiosity to be examined or exploited. He is a 5-year-old boy who did a brave thing and who now deserves to return to a normal life." Morgan's eyes swept across the assembled reporters. "I am asking you, not as Morgan Freeman, the actor, but as someone who cares deeply about the welfare of a child, to respect his privacy and that of his family. There will be no interviews, no photographs, and no further details about his involvement. This is my only statement on the matter, and I will not be taking questions." The press conference sparked a fresh wave of coverage, but Morgan's words had their intended effect. Major networks reported on the story with more restraint, focusing on the human trafficking ring and the rescued victims rather than Lucas's role. Local officials issued statements supporting the call for privacy. But as Morgan drove back to the safe house, he knew this was just the beginning. The world had caught a glimpse of Lucas's extraordinary gift, and some would not be so easily deterred. Protecting the boy from unwanted attention would require vigilance and resources that Sarah simply didn't have. As he pulled into the driveway, Morgan had already begun formulating a longer-term plan, one that would provide Lucas and Sarah with the security they needed while helping the boy understand and manage his remarkable ability. Whatever connection allowed Lucas to perceive the suffering of others was both a gift and a burden, and Morgan felt increasingly responsible for ensuring it didn't overwhelm the child's chance at a normal life. A week after the press conference, Morgan Freeman sat on the porch of a secluded lakeside cabin, watching as Lucas skipped stones across the water. The safe house, provided by a private security firm Morgan had hired, was tucked away in the Georgia mountains, far from the media spotlight that continued to flicker around the story. Sarah sat nearby, a book open but unread in her lap, her eyes following her son's movements with a mixture of love and lingering concern. "He seems almost normal here," she said quietly. "Just a regular kid playing by the water." Morgan nodded, understanding the weight behind her observation. In the days following their relocation, Lucas had shown more childlike behavior than at any time since their paths first crossed in McDonald's. He laughed, played, and occasionally even whined like any 5-year-old. But there were still moments when that unnerving awareness would return to his eyes, and he would grow quiet, distant, tuned to frequencies others couldn't perceive. "May I join him?" Morgan asked. Sarah nodded. "He'd like that. He's been drawing pictures of you two together." Morgan made his way down to the lake's edge, where Lucas had found a perfect skipping stone. The boy turned at his approach, his smile brightening. "Mr. Freeman, look how far I can throw it." He demonstrated with surprising skill, the stone bouncing 4 times before sinking. "Impressive," Morgan said, settling onto a large rock nearby. "Would you like to sit with me for a bit? I've been wanting to talk to you." Lucas nodded, climbing up to sit beside him. For a moment they simply watched the water together, its surface rippling in the gentle breeze. "Lucas," Morgan began, his deep voice gentle. "I've been thinking about what you can do, how you know things others don't." The boy nodded, suddenly solemn. "Mom says I shouldn't talk about it with anyone but you and Detective Harlow." "Your mom is very wise," Morgan agreed, "but I want you to know that you're not alone. There are others who have experienced similar things." Lucas looked up with interest. "Other kids like me?" "Some kids, yes, and some adults." Morgan paused, carefully considering his next words. "When I was about your age, I had an experience that I've never fully understood. I knew my grandfather had died before anyone told me. I woke up in the middle of the night and told my mother he was gone. An hour later, the phone rang with the news." Lucas nodded, unsurprised. "You could feel it." "Yes. And there were other moments too. Times when I seemed to know things I shouldn't have known." Morgan looked out over the lake. "But nothing like what you experience." "It's loud sometimes," Lucas said quietly. "All the sad people, all the scared people. They're calling out, but most people can't hear them." Morgan felt a profound ache at the child's words. "How do you handle it, Lucas, when it gets loud?" The boy shrugged. "I try to help when I can, like with the lady with yellow shoes. But sometimes I can't do anything, and that's the hardest part." His small face creased with a worry no 5-year-old should carry. "Mom gets scared when I talk about it too much. She took me to doctors, but they just said, I have a vivid imagination." Morgan nodded, understanding. "Adults often try to explain away things they don't understand. But you believe me," Lucas said. "It wasn't a question. I do." Morgan met the boy's eyes directly. "I've seen enough of life to know there are mysteries beyond our understanding. What you can do is extraordinary, Lucas, and valuable. You've already saved lives." The boy picked up another stone, turning it over in his small hands. "But what happens now? Those people on TV want to talk to me. They want to see if I'm real." "That's not going to happen," Morgan assured him. "I promise you that. But I have been thinking about how to help you understand and manage your ability." Lucas looked up expectantly. "I have a friend," Morgan continued, "a researcher who studies unusual perceptual abilities. She works with people who experience the world differently, some who can see patterns others miss, some who have extraordinary memory, some who sense things beyond normal perception." "Like me?" Lucas asked. "Similar to you, yes. She helps them learn to control when and how they use their abilities so it doesn't become overwhelming." Morgan paused. "If your mom agrees, I thought she might be able to help you understand what's happening when you perceive these things." Lucas seemed to consider this carefully before nodding. "Would she make it stop?" "I don't want it to stop completely. Then I couldn't help people anymore." Morgan was struck by the child's instinctive understanding. "No, not stop it. Just help you manage it better, so it doesn't interrupt your normal life so much." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a heron glide across the lake before landing gracefully at the far shore. "Mr. Freeman," Lucas said finally, "why did I see you in the McDonald's that day? Why did I know to tell you about those people?" It was a question Morgan had pondered extensively. "I don't know for certain," he admitted, "but perhaps because people listen when I speak, because my voice carries weight." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "It's more than that. You were supposed to be there. I was supposed to find you." He looked up, his eyes suddenly older again. "There are more people who need help. I can feel them, but I can't do it alone." Morgan felt the weight of the boy's words settle around him like a mantle. What had begun as a chance encounter in a fast food restaurant had evolved into something profound, a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. "Lucas," he said carefully, "I want to help you, but I also want you to have a normal childhood, to play, to learn, to grow up without carrying too heavy a burden." "But I already see them," Lucas replied simply. "Whether I tell anyone or not, I still see them, and if I don't tell, no one helps them." The moral clarity of the child's position was humbling. Morgan found himself nodding slowly in acknowledgement. "Then perhaps we can find a middle path," he suggested, "a way for you to share what you perceive when necessary, without sacrificing your childhood or your privacy." As they talked, Morgan outlined the beginnings of what he envisioned, a carefully structured system that would allow Lucas to communicate his perceptions to those who could act on them, while keeping him safely removed from public attention or official involvement. Sarah joined them eventually, her initial hesitation giving way to cautious hope as Morgan explained his ideas. "It won't be perfect," Morgan acknowledged, "but it could allow Lucas to help when he can, while still protecting him." As the sun began to set over the lake, casting long golden reflections across the water, Morgan watched Lucas return to skipping stones, momentarily just a boy enjoying a simple pleasure. But the conversation had crystallized something Morgan had been feeling since that first whispered warning in McDonald's, that he had been drawn into Lucas's extraordinary world for a purpose. That his voice, recognizable and respected around the world, could now serve as a conduit for perceptions that might otherwise go unheard. It was an understanding that would change both their lives irrevocably, binding the famous actor and the remarkable child in a mission neither could have anticipated. 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon in McDonald's, when a 5-year-old boy had approached Morgan Freeman's table and whispered words that would change both their lives forever. Now on a crisp autumn morning, Morgan stood at the podium in front of a modest building just outside Atlanta, addressing a small gathering of carefully selected guests. "Today marks the official opening of the Freeman Perception Institute," he announced, his distinctive voice carrying across the attentive audience. "A place dedicated to understanding and supporting extraordinary perceptual abilities, particularly in children." The building behind him was purposefully understated, a renovated country estate surrounded by acres of wooded land that provided both security and serenity. What few knew was that the Institute had actually been operational for nearly 3 months, working quietly with its first group of remarkable children. "Our mission is simple," Morgan continued, "to provide a safe environment where children with unusual perceptive gifts can learn to understand and manage their abilities, to connect them with resources that can help them thrive, and to create responsible channels through which their insights might benefit others." He didn't mention Lucas by name, a protection they had maintained rigorously, but his gaze found the boy sitting in the front row beside Sarah. Now 6 years old, Lucas looked much like any other child his age, though his eyes still carried that hint of knowing that had first caught Morgan's attention. As Morgan concluded his remarks and the small crowd began to disperse for the guided tour, Detective Harlow, now a regular consultant to the Institute, approached him. 3 more rescues last month," she said quietly. "The Tennessee case was particularly remarkable. Without the information we received, those girls would never have been found in time." Morgan nodded, well aware of the case she referenced. What had begun as a structured system to channel Lucas's perceptions had evolved into something broader. The Institute now worked with law enforcement agencies across 5 states, providing carefully anonymized information that had led to numerous successful interventions. "How is he doing?" Harlow asked, nodding toward Lucas, who was now playing with 2 other children near the garden. "Better," Morgan replied. "Dr. Ellington's techniques are helping him establish boundaries, times when he focuses on his abilities, and times when he's just allowed to be a child." The methodology they had developed was uniquely tailored to Lucas's extraordinary gift. Working with specialists in neuroscience, psychology, and meditation, they had helped him learn to regulate the loudness of the perceptions that once overwhelmed him. He could now, to some extent, choose when to listen to the whispers of those in danger and when to simply be a 6-year-old boy enjoying ordinary pleasures. "And the others?" Harlow asked, gesturing toward the children playing with Lucas. "Each different but equally remarkable," Morgan said. "Amelia can pinpoint the location of missing objects with uncanny accuracy. Michael experiences what his mother calls empathic resonance. He physically feels the emotions of those around him." He watched the children with a mixture of wonder and protectiveness. They're learning from each other, finding community in their difference. The Institute now worked with 7 children, each displaying perceptual abilities that defied conventional explanation. Some, like Lucas, could somehow access information about people in danger. Others demonstrated different gifts, pattern recognition beyond normal capability, sensory perception that extended beyond typical boundaries, or intuitive. Understanding that seemed to transcend ordinary cognition. Morgan's role had evolved as well. What had begun as a personal commitment to protecting one remarkable child had grown into a mission that increasingly defined his life. He split his time between his acting career and the Institute, using his influence to secure funding, connect with specialists, and, when necessary, shield the children from unwanted attention. The victims from the factory case have been asking to meet him, Harlow mentioned, especially the young woman who said she saw him in her dreams. Morgan shook his head. Not yet, perhaps when he's older. For now, our priority is giving him as normal a childhood as possible. As they spoke, Sarah approached them, looking more relaxed than Morgan had seen her since the day they met. The Institute had provided her with not just security, but community, other parents who understood the challenges of raising a child with extraordinary perceptions. "He's having a good day," she said, watching Lucas laugh as he played tag with his new friends. "Last night was harder. He woke up crying about a fire somewhere, people trapped inside." Her expression grew serious. Dr. Ellington helped him process it, and we passed the information along through the protocols. "I heard they found the building this morning." Morgan nodded, familiar with the careful system they had established. Lucas's perceptions were documented by child psychologists, then anonymized and channeled through trusted law enforcement contacts. His identity remained protected, while the information he provided could still save lives. "You've given him something." "I couldn't on my own," Sarah said, looking at Morgan. "A way to use his gift without being consumed by it." As the afternoon progressed, Morgan found a quiet moment to sit with Lucas beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the property. The boy was drawing in a sketchbook, a practice that helped him process his perceptions. "How are you feeling today?" Morgan asked. Lucas looked up, his expression brightening. "Good. Dr. Ellington taught me a new technique for when the voices get too loud. It helps a lot." "I'm glad to hear that." Lucas returned to his drawing for a moment, then said, "There's a girl in Tennessee who needs help. I saw her last night." "We've already notified the authorities," Morgan assured him. "They're looking into it right now." The boy nodded, satisfied. Then, with the rapid subject change characteristic of children his age, he asked, "Will you read just a story later? Michael and Amelia want to hear your voice." Morgan smiled. "Of course." As Lucas ran off to rejoin his friends, Morgan reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him here. What had begun with a whispered warning in a McDonald's had transformed into a legacy far more meaningful than any film role. The Freeman Perception Institute stood as a testament to the extraordinary potential of human perception and to the responsibility that came with recognizing gifts that existed beyond ordinary understanding. Later that evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Morgan gathered with the children in the Institute's common room. His deep, resonant voice filled the space as he read from a book chosen by the children, their faces alight with the simple joy of storytelling. In that moment, watching Lucas sitting contentedly among peers who understood his difference, Morgan knew that their work had only just begun. There would be more children with extraordinary gifts, more lives touched by their remarkable perceptions, more challenges in balancing their unique abilities with the needs of normal childhood. But as Lucas caught his eye and smiled, a genuine, carefree smile that belonged truly to a child, Morgan felt the rightness of the path they had chosen. Together they had transformed an unexpected encounter into a legacy of understanding, protection, and purpose, one that would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways they might never fully know, but that Lucas, with his extraordinary perception, would always somehow see. And so, Morgan concluded, his iconic voice giving weight to the final words of the story, they discovered that their differences weren't burdens to be hidden, but gifts to be shared, in their own way, in their own time, changing the world one small miracle at a time.